Hi everyone, we will be discussing to you the Gestalt Psychology.
Learning objectives. In this module, challenge yourself to attain the following learning outcomes. First, describe the different Gestalt principles. Second, list ways of applying Gestalt psychology in teaching learning process. And last, demonstrate appreciation of the usefulness of Gestalt principles in the teaching learning process.
Gestalt psychology was at the forefront of the cognitive psychology. It serves as the foundation of the cognitive perspective to learning. It opposed the external and mechanistic focus of behaviorism. It considered the mental processes and products of perceptions. Therefore, Gestalt is a psychology term. It is a hypothesis that people tend to organize visual elements into groups or unified wholes when certain principles are applied. Gestalt theory was the initial cognitive response to behaviorism. It emphasized the importance of sensory in the dynamic nature of visual perception. The term Gestalt means form of configuration. Gestalt theory focuses on the mind's perception processes, how the mind perceives things. So it's not really looking at how I perceive things, it's how do we perceive things, and then our mind takes that information and interprets it. So one of the three ways that we can think about Gestalt theory is a way a thing has been placed or put together. And there is actually no real direct English translation. So we're really looking at things visually, perceptually, and how we interpret those things. How do we put different components of what's going on around us together, and how do we interpret that in our minds? Psychologists Max Wertheimer, Wolfgang Kohler, and Kurt Kufa studied perception and concluded the perceivers or learners are not passive but rather active. It simply means that they suggested that learners do not just collect information as is, but they actively process and reconstruct data in order to understand it. This is the perceptual process. Certain factors impact on this perceptual process. Factors like past experiences, needs, attitudes, and one's present situation can affect their perception. One may have difficulty perceiving both the words you and me. In the first picture in the activity, if one is trying to forget an ex-sweetheart who caused pain, or simply because he was looking on the foreground and not on the background. According to the Gestalt psychologist, the way we form our perceptions are guided by certain principles or laws. These principles or laws determine what we see or make of things or situations we met. So we will now proceed to the Gestalt principles. And here are the examples of the Gestalt laws. Law of similarity, law of fragrance, or the law of good figure, law of proximity, law of continuity, law of closure, and the law of common region. First is law of proximity. Law of proximity is the elements that are closer together will be perceived as a coherent object. On the left, there appears to be 3 columns, while on the right, there appears to be 3 horizontal laws. Proximity principle states that elements that look similar will perceive as part of the same form. Proximity principle states that elements that look similar will perceive as part of the same form. It simply means that objects close to one another are grouped together. Next is the law of similarity. Elements that look similar will perceive as part of the same form. There seems to be a triangle in the square. We link similar elements together. It simply means that objects that are similar to one another are grouped together. Next is the law of closure. We tend to fill the gaps or close the figures we perceive. We enclose a space by completing a contour and ignoring gaps in the figure. So, this states that when we see an image that may have missing parts to it, our brain are going to fill these missing parts and complete the image in our head. We just fill it in with our imagination. Next is the law of good continuation. Individuals have the tendency to continue contours whenever the elements of the pattern establish an implied direction. People tend to draw a good continuous line. Good continuation simply means that people perceive continuously flowing in smooth lines even with interruption. The last is the law of good programs. The stimulus will be organized into as good a figure as possible. In this example, good refers to symmetry, simplicity, and regularity. The figure perceived as square overlapping a triangle, not a combination of several complicated shapes. This principle is based on the idea that we perceive images as simple rather than complete, complex rather than incomplete.
Gestalt psychology adheres to the idea of learning taking place by discovery or insight. The insight of learning was first developed by Wolfgang Kohler, in which he described experiments with apes where the apes could use boxes and sticks as tools to solve problems. In the box problem, a banana is attached to the top of chimpanzee's cage. The banana is out of reach but can be reached by climbing on and jumping from a box. Only one of Kohler's apes, Sultan, could solve this problem. So, the theorist Kohler connected Gestalt psychology to the natural sciences, arguing that organic phenomena are examples of holism at work. He did hearing and looked at problem-solving abilities in chimpanzees. A much more difficult problem required the ape to stack one box on another, and the ape sticks which they used to rake food into the cage. Sultan, Kohler's very intelligent ape, was able to master a two-stick problem by inserting one stick into the end of the other in order to reach the food. So the problem was solved by placing the smaller sticks into the longer stick to create one very long stick that could be used to knock down the hanging fruit. In the second scenario, the chimps would solve the problem by stacking the boxes on top of each other, which allowed them to climb up to the top of the stack of boxes and reach the fruit. In each of these problems, the important aspect of learning was not reinforcement, but the coordination of thinking to create new organizations of materials. Kohler referred to the behavior as insight or discover learning. Kohler proposed the view that insight follows from the characteristics of objects under consideration. So here, learning occurs in variety of ways. Sometimes, it is the result of direct observation. Other times, it is the result of experience through personal interaction with the environment. Kohler called this newly observed type of learning insight learning. Based on these observations, Kohler's theory of insight learning became an early argument for the involvement of cognition or thinking process. His theory suggested that learning could occur when the individual perceives the relationship of the elements before him and reorganizes these elements and comes to a greater understanding of insight. This could occur without reinforcement, and once it occurs, no review, training, or investigation is necessary. Significantly, insight is not necessarily observable by another person. So in gestaltic perspective, the organismic needs of man, the authentic needs of auto-realization are respected. It stimulates learning as experience and the experience as a source of learning. It appreciates the affections and meaning that we attribute to what we learn. Knowledge is conceived as a continuous organization and rearrangement of information according to needs, purposes, and meanings. Gestalt principles and the teaching-learning process. The 6 Gestalt principles not only influence perception, but they also impact on learning. Other psychologists like Kurt Lewin expounded on Gestalt psychology. His theory focusing on life space adhered to Gestalt psychology. He said that an individual has inner and outer forces that affect his perceptions and also his learning. Inner forces may include his own motivations, attitudes, and feelings. So, Gestalt theory emphasizes that the whole of anything is greater than its part. That is, the attributes of the whole are not deductive in isolation. The word Gestalt is used in modern German to mean the way a thing has been placed or put together. There is no exact equivalent in English. Form and shape are the usual translations. In psychology, the word is often interpreted as pattern or configuration. Outer forces may include the attitude and behavior of the teacher and students. All these forces interact and impact on the person's learning. Mario Polito, an Italian psychologist, writes about the relevance of Gestalt psychology to education. It takes interest in the complexity of experience without neglecting anything, but accepting and amplifying all the emerges. The fundamental objective of this approach is the creative adaptation of each individual with the organism environment field. In the Gestaltic perspective, the organismic needs of man, the authentic needs of auto-realization are respected. The Gestalt theory is focused on the experience of contact that occurs in here and now. It considers with interest the life space of teacher as well as students. It takes interest in the complexity of experience without neglecting anything, but accepting and amplifying all that emerges. It stimulates learning as experience and the experience as a source of learning. It appreciates the affections and meaning that we attribute to what we learn. So, it is stated here that Gestalt psychology is a school of thought that looks at the human mind and behavior as a whole. When trying to make sense of the world around us, Gestalt psychology suggests that we do not simply focus on every small component. Instead, our minds tend to perceive objects as part of a greater whole and as elements of more complex system. Knowledge is conceived as a continuous organization and rearrangement of information according to needs, purposes, and meanings. It asserts that learning is not accumulation, but remodeling or insight. Autonomy and freedom of the students is stimulated by the teacher. The time necessary for assimilation and for cognitive and existential remodeling is respected. The contact experience between teachers and students is given value. An authentic meeting based on sharing ideas and affections. So here, it is always important having a good collaborative learning towards the teachers and the students. wherein it is the best way to explain and share the thoughts and ideas using the personal experiences.